Thank you for joining our Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer webinar on the role of clinical trials for cancer patients. Clinical trials are the primary means by which new cancer treatments are developed, tested, and approved. In this webinar, you will learn why a clinical trial may be right for you, understand the different phases of and common terms used in clinical trials, and hear tips on talking to your doctor about your clinical trial options. I am Margaret and I will be moderating today's webinar. I am the Program Director for Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and recently completed my doctorate. My clinical and research background is focused on working collaboratively with doctors, patients, their families, and members of a healthcare team. We would like to thank Genentech for providing funding to help make this webinar possible. We would also like to thank our promotional partners, the American Association for Cancer Research, the Anti-Cancer Club, Canadian Cancer Survivors Network, Cure Magazine, the Esophageal Cancer Action Network, Meals to Heal, and Patient Resource. You will be able to ask questions during this presentation. You can type your question into the white text box that appears on your screen. At the conclusion of the presentation, we will address questions as time allows. In addition, the recording of this webinar will be accessible on our website in approximately 1 week. First, I will introduce Debbie Zellman, who will share with you her journey and information about Debbie's Dream Foundation. Then we will listen to a presentation by Dr. Barbara Burtness of the Yale Cancer Center. We will conclude with a presentation with a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. I would now like to introduce the president and founder of Debbie's Dream Foundation, Debbie Zellman.
Thank you so much, Margaret, and hello to everyone. Thank you for your patience as we got these difficulties resolved. I, as many of you probably know, I'm the president and founder of Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer. I was diagnosed with stage 4 stomach cancer in April of 2008. At the time of my diagnosis, I was only 40 years old. I was the mother of 3 young children, married to a physician, and I was a practicing attorney with my own firm. I had no risk factors for stomach cancer, and my symptoms were very vague. I was told that my chance of being alive in 5 years was only 4%. However, I'm happy to tell you that it has been over 7 years since my diagnosis, but many of you probably don't realize that I have had 5 recurrences in that 7 years and that I am still a patient. Next slide. In April of 2009, which is a year after my diagnosis, I started Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer. We are a member of the Deadliest Cancers Coalition, the Patient Equal Access Coalition, the State Patient Equal Access Coalition, and One Voice Against Cancer. I personally serve as a patient advocate on the National Cancer Institute Esophagogastric Task Force and the Patient Advocacy Steering Committee. I'm also on the NCCN Gastric and Esophageal Guidelines Committee. I am on the CDMRP Department of Defense Peer Review Cancer Research Program Programmatic Panel, as well as the ASCO HER2 Testing Guidelines Project in Gastric Cancer, and the American Cancer Society Research Program Stakeholder. However, people tell me that my most notable achievement is that I have appeared on Dr. Oz in a program about stomach cancer. Next slide. So some facts about stomach cancer. It's one of the leading causes of cancer death worldwide, second in men and fourth in women. Each year, almost 1 million people worldwide are diagnosed with stomach cancer, and approximately 700,000 will die. More than 24,000 Americans will be diagnosed this year, and more than 11,000 will die. Stomach cancer is on the rise in young people, ages 25 to 39. However, per cancer death, stomach cancer receives the least amount of federal research funds of any cancer. When I was diagnosed, there were few resources and support services for stomach cancer patients, and many people knew very little about this deadly disease. Next slide. So our mission is to change all of that, which was what happened when I was diagnosed. Our mission is to raise awareness about stomach cancer, advance funding for research, and provide education and support internationally to patients, families, and caregivers. And our ultimate goal is to make the cure for stomach cancer a reality. I encourage you all to visit our website at www.debustream.org. Next slide. On that website, you will see a lot of things, including many milestones that we have reached already in our barely 6.5 years of existence. We have a free patient resource education program that we call PrEP. It helps hundreds of patients, families, and caregivers throughout the world, and it matches the inquirer, whether it's the inquirer is the patient, a family member, or a caregiver, or a friend, and we match that inquirer with another survivor or caregiver using specific disease criteria. We held free stomach cancer symposia and webinars throughout the year, including today's webinar. We have 29 chapters in the United States, Canada, and Germany, and events across the United States and Canada. We have authorized $350,000 in research grant funding. But we've also made a big impact on the federal funding of research dollars for stomach cancer. We've had 3 Capitol Hill advocacy days, as well as a Capitol Hill briefing about stomach cancer. Very important, we have achieved getting stomach cancer included in a $50 million pot of money that the Department of Defense allots for a peer-reviewed cancer research program. Stomach cancer is now one of the 11 cancers included in that pot of money, and that was solely due to the advocacy of W Stream Foundation advocates. In addition, our website is so rich. It includes in-depth information about stomach cancer, a lecture library including all the lectures in this webinar series, clinical trial information, and a free clinical trial matching service, a stomach cancer support community that is like no other. It is really so rich and much more in-depth and involved than any social media group can be. It is one of a kind, and I highly encourage everyone to join that support community. We have a blog with many different topics, as well as many resources, and our website is completely translatable into more than 60 languages. Next slide. So here's a little snapshot of our website homepage, so you can all see how friendly and easily navigable it is. So I really encourage you all to get involved. And now I'm going to turn the webinar back over to Margaret, and she'll tell you more about how to get involved. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Debbie. As you can see on your screen, there are many events that are taking place across the country and throughout the month of November. This coming Saturday in Chicago, Illinois, is our Stomach Cancer Education Symposium. This is also a webcast and completely free to anyone who attends either in person or via webcast. It's a highly recommended event where we host experts in the field of gastric cancer to speak on various topics that are important and also completely interactive, allowing you to ask questions whether you are live in the audience or listening in from your home or office. On Sunday, November 8th is our New York Night of Laughter. And all this month is Curing Stomach Cancer Month, and there are many events throughout the country that are dedicated just to celebrating Curing Stomach Cancer Month. So please visit our website, www.debustream.org, to learn more about events that are taking place in your area. On Friday, November 13th is the International Stomach Cancer Genes Day. This is an excellent way to raise awareness about stomach cancer, as well as to have a fun day in the office or school or your organization where you get to wear jeans for a cause. And on January 24th of 2016, we will have a team participating in the Miami Marathon and Half Marathon. For more information about these and many more events, please check our website. W Stream Foundation is headquartered in Plantation, Florida. Our office is open from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. On this slide, you will see important phone numbers and email addresses to contact our office. And we will go ahead and begin the presentation on clinical trials with Dr. Burtness. Dr. Burtness is the co-leader of the Developmental Therapeutics Program at Yale Cancer Center and a faculty member in the Medical Oncology Center at Yale University School of Medicine. She is a member of the U.S. National Cancer Institute GI Steering Committee Task Force on esophagogastric cancer and has published on therapy and biomarkers of locally advanced and metastatic esophagogastric cancer. We are thrilled and pleased to have Dr. Burtness as a member of our Medical Advisory Board. And at this time, I will turn the webinar over to Dr. Burtness.
Hi, welcome everybody. I just need to start off by saying how much admiration I have for what Debbie's Dream does. You heard a little bit about the impact she's had on fostering research for people with stomach cancer. I've had the privilege of being in the room at the task force when she's battling for patients to have access to more clinical trials. So it's just fantastic that Debbie's Dream is growing the way that it is, and the work that it's doing is wonderful. And so what I was asked to do today is to kind of give a little bit of a primer on clinical trials and why is it that clinical trials are out there, why is it that more people are not on clinical trials, and what are the things that as a patient or an advocate for a patient you should be thinking about in terms of whether or not a trial is the right move, and which trial you might be most interested in. So it's just a little picture of the Healing Garden here at the Yale Cancer Center with a view out over downtown New Haven. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start out with just a little bit about what we're thinking about gastric cancer these days, because it frames a lot of the kinds of clinical trials questions. And the landscape in clinical trials for stomach cancer has changed a lot in recent years, and the questions that we're asking are a lot different than they were in the past. So what are some of the reasons for this? The first thing is that there was a federally financed effort to understand the genetic makeup of stomach cancer. So they collected hundreds of stomach cancer specimens from different pathology departments, and they subjected them to analysis to look at what kinds of proteins were expressed, were there mutations in the genes in these cancers, were there other changes in the cells in these cancers. And by doing a very big data kind of analysis, they were able to integrate all of this information and come to the conclusion that there are 4 main subtypes of stomach cancer, and I'll show you a little bit of that in a minute. But this is not what we thought that we knew. We thought we knew that there were 2 main types of stomach cancer, and it turns out that actually the most appropriate type of targeted therapy is probably pretty different for these 4 main subtypes. And so some of the research questions that you'll hear me talking about have to do with personalizing therapy so that the therapy is a better match for the person's particular type of stomach cancer. Then we've known for a long time that surgery can cure people with stomach cancer, and there's been a lot of refinement in how we establish what the stage of the cancer is and whether it's a stage where surgery can stand alone, or whether if it's a little bit more advanced of a cancer, the surgery should be augmented with chemotherapy or radiation, or chemotherapy plus radiation. We also know that once a cancer has spread beyond the local lymph nodes, you need to have some kind of treatment that can also go further. So surgery and radiation are kind of local treatments, and we need to add medical treatments that can reach all of the places that the bloodstream can carry cancer cells to. But we're increasingly becoming aware that in some of these subtypes of stomach cancer, local therapies can be a good adjunct to chemotherapy or immunotherapy. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of kind of the top-level data that was included in the paper about the intrinsic subtypes of stomach cancer. And on the top, you can see a number of genes that are thought to be sort of commonly abnormal in stomach cancer. And down at the bottom, you can see some differences in what kinds of genes are transcribed or seem to be actively signaling. And they've broken this up in a couple of different ways. Up top, they've broken it up into the 4 main subtypes of stomach cancer. And then down at the bottom, they've also broken it down by the kind of what's the domain that those genes are involved in. And so just reading across the top, the 4 main types of stomach cancer that we now think about are, the first kind is related to Epstein-Barr virus, which is like the same virus that causes mono. The second is called microsatellite unstable, and this is a kind that's probably very suitable for immunotherapy, and might be something that strikes younger people and might be more associated with familial inheritance. Then there's the genomically stable, and CIN basically genomically unstable or having a lot of chromosomal abnormalities. And so increasingly, when we're meeting a new patient with stomach cancer, we're trying to figure out which of these 4 classes does the person fit into. Additionally, many of you may have heard about a test called HER2 that showed up here as ERB2 on this slide, but that's a specific molecular target that we have medicines for, and so it's really important for us to know about the presence or absence of a HER2 abnormality, because we want to choose make the right decision about including the HER2-directed medicine. And then if you look down at the lower right-hand part of the picture, you can see that they've been able to break some of the gene classes up so that, for example, in the Epstein-Barr virus related type cancer and the microsatellite unstable, there seems to be a lot of signaling that has to do with our immune cells. So these are kinds of cancers that might be particularly well suited to immunotherapy. Whereas in the genomically stable, it looks like maybe genes that have to do with cell migration or the ability of the cells to travel are particularly important. And then mitotic pathways that you see kind of across the board there, that's the propensity of cancer cells to divide more. And then over on the left is a little bit more futuristic, but identifying some of the other genes that we might be able to have medicines that would target them that seem to be important in stomach cancer, and KRAS and PIK3CA and PTEN you see there. Okay, next slide. So that's just a little background to frame the questions. And now let's talk a little bit about just what clinical trials are. So a clinical trial is a thing where a participant, who's a voluntary participant, gets a specific intervention for their disease, and everything about how that intervention is done is spelled out according to a research plan or a protocol. And so that intervention could be a drug. In stomach cancer, very often it is a new treatment for stomach cancer. But it could also be a device, or it could be a specific procedure, like you know, doing surgery before or after a course of radiation, something like that. Sometimes clinical trials are done to compare a new medical approach to a standard one that's already available, or to a placebo that doesn't have any active ingredients, or to no intervention. And so comparisons to placebo or to no intervention are sometimes done in diseases where there's absolutely no known treatment, like low back pain. In cancer in general, you'll see that both arms of a randomized trial would have some kind of active intervention. And some clinical trials are actually done to compare 2 interventions that people already do, but they don't know which one is better, to compare those to each other. Next slide, please. And the FDA is very involved in regulating clinical trials, and particularly clinical trials that involve giving new drugs to people. And they've established this sort of outline that actually has 5 different phases: phase 0, 1, 2, and 3, and 4 actually, but I don't have 4 on here because I think it's a little bit less important and a little bit less likely to be relevant in stomach cancer. So phase 0, also probably not that relevant. These are exploratory trials. They usually have very limited human exposure, like a single dose. Sometimes they might be done in a preoperative setting, but I think not that relevant probably for most people. Phase 1 trials are trials that are done to find out what the right dose of a medicine is, and the right dose of a medicine is often determined by how frequent and severe the side effects are and how long the medicine stays in a person's system. So in one of these trials, the first people who go into the trial might get a pretty low dose of the medicine. And then if everything appeared to be very safe, the next group of people might get an intermediate dose of the medicine. And if everything seemed to be safe, then the next group might get a higher dose of the medicine. And that would continue until the investigators had found what they thought the right dose, the best balance of safety and actually getting effective levels of the medicine. So until they had found what that right dose was. And in the past, phase 1 trials were seen as not offering a lot of benefit to patients. There was a lot of concern that with new classes of medicine that there might be very severe side effects that people were unprepared for. And so in general, as a patient, you would only hear about a phase 1 trial if the people who were treating you thought that there was nothing left of benefit to you in standard medicine. That has really changed like 180 degrees in the past couple of years, and the reasons for that are a couple-fold. One is that to speed up drug development, sometimes drugs stay in phase 1 for a lot longer. But the main reason is that we have so many new ways of approaching cancer that were not available a few years ago. And so the new immunotherapies and the new targeted therapies, even though they might still be in phase 1, really offer quite a lot of promise in a lot of cases, and might offer really better promise than standard treatment in some cases. And so if you go on the internet and you read about phase 1 and you kind of see information about it's not for the patient's benefit and save this for last, that you really should know that that kind of thinking is changing a lot, and for good reason. So then phase 2 trials, as defined by the FDA, are trials that are done to find out how active a given intervention is in a certain disease. And so here it would be, a new chemotherapy drug or a new immunotherapy drug. How many people with stomach cancer see their cancer shrink in response to that medicine? And you can usually figure that out with pretty good precision with under 100 patients. So these trials tend to go pretty quickly. And then phase 3 trials are trials that are meant to be really statistically definitive, to show with 95% certainty, or 92% certainty anyway, whether or not a new approach or a new treatment is equivalent to or maybe even better than the standard. And like I mentioned on the prior slide, historically sometimes these trials were done with a new treatment being compared to a placebo, but usually in cancer studies what's going on is that both groups will receive what's seen as the standard treatment, and then the new drug will be added to one group and not to the other. Or if the new drug looks like it's better than standard treatment, it might be standard treatment against the new drug. Next slide, please. So I also wanted to say a word about phase 1b expansion trials, which is something that there are a lot of them out there now. And again, it's part of understanding how phase 1 trials are changing over time. So sometimes a new drug will be undergoing development, and it'll go through the phase 1 portion fairly quickly, and they come to the right dose, and it's the dose that's safe and maintains good drug levels. And they will then want very rapidly to make sure the dose is also useful in specific kinds of cancer, lung cancer or kidney cancer or stomach cancer or whatever. And so rather than shut down the phase 1 trial and begin the process of getting approval to do multiple phase 2 trials in all these different diseases, they'll just expand the phase 1 trial with small cohorts of patients, usually about 20 patients, but sometimes as many as 40 or 50, in each of the additional diseases that they're thinking about taking the drug forward in. And if you've been following at all the information about immunotherapy with the new drugs like Keytruda and Opdivo, a lot of the patients who were first able to get these medicines did so in the phase 1b expansion cohorts before the big trials went forward that were disease specific. And so this is a point that I've been making over and over again here, but phase 1 trials are much more common and much more readily available than they used to be. And this is driven by the new treatments for cancer, the large number of cancer patients and survivors who are looking for trials, and also I think it's important to mention that under the Affordable Care Act, patients' rights with respect to having access to clinical trials have gotten better. Okay, next slide. I'm sorry, Margaret, next slide.
It's just taking a moment to load
here. Okay,
Sorry.
Thank you. No problem. So who runs clinical trials? Every clinical study is led by a person who's called the principal investigator, and this is usually a medical doctor, sometimes maybe a nurse practitioner, but somebody who's experienced in the treatment of the disease and who's experienced in doing clinical research, knows how to collect data, knows how to report complications, knows how to do the regulatory processes to make sure that everything's always supervised correctly. And that person is often working hand in glove with what we call a sponsor. And the sponsor could be a cancer center or a hospital. The sponsor could be the cooperative groups, which are these big federally funded networks of clinical investigators that try to improve access to new treatments at many hospitals around the country. Or the sponsor could be a pharmaceutical company that has a new drug that they're trying to bring forward for a given disease. And then the studies are carried out by teams, and that team usually includes other cancer doctors besides just the principal investigator, and the nurses and the infusion room nurses and the technicians and the social workers and the radiation people and the imaging people and everybody who's required to carry out the care that's specified in the protocol. Clinical studies are expensive to run, and patients don't pay to participate in them. So they need to be federally financed in some way, and they can be supported by the pharmaceutical companies, by academic medical centers or freestanding cancer centers, by voluntary groups, by other organizations like the National Institutes of Health or the Department of Defense or the VA. Next slide, please. Who can participate in clinical trials? So every clinical study will have standards that outline who can participate, which we would say who is eligible. So those are eligibility criteria. And some research studies are actually open to healthy participants, but what we're talking about here would be studies that are open to people who have had or do have stomach cancer. Next slide. So what are these eligibility criteria? They're designed both to make sure that we do as much as possible to keep people in the study safe. So if there's a particular pre-existing medical condition that we think would be made worse by the study treatment, in general, somebody who had that medical problem would not be able to go in the trial. And the factors are also spelled out so that the people who are included in the trial have cancer that's similar enough to one another that some conclusions about how helpful the treatment is could be drawn in a meaningful way. So in general, if you wanted to find out how effective a treatment was in stomach cancer, you would not include people with bladder cancer and skin cancer in the study, even though you might want to know if the medicine was also helpful to people with bladder cancer, but you would not include them in a trial where the main purpose was to find out whether or not the treatment worked for stomach cancer. So every trial has these so-called these so-called inclusion criteria, and may also have inclusion criteria, like I mentioned, if there's a particular disorder that would be made worse by the treatment. And so very often these spell out that you have to be over age 18 and what stage of stomach cancer you have and how much prior treatment you may have had and things like that. So as a patient or a patient advocate, if you're looking for a clinical trial, some of the things you might want to pay attention to are, does this trial accept people who've previously had treatment for their cancer? So does this have to be given as the first treatment or the second treatment, or can any number of prior treatments be okay? A lot of clinical trials for cancer also specify what we call performance status, and that's what you might think of as how fit or how active or how mobile a person is. So in general, clinical trials would exclude people who were so ill that they were in bed all the time, or had been requiring very frequent hospitalization, or were unable to care for themselves. And the concern there really is that the new treatment might make them sicker than they already are. Kidney and liver function are things that can sometimes be affected by prior treatments that you've had, and that can sometimes be a barrier to getting into clinical trials. And then some trials require that the cancer be visible and measurable on a CAT scan or a PET scan or something like that, and other trials do not. Next slide. So participants in clinical trials have a lot of rights, and these rights are spelled out. They should be spelled out on paper and openly discussed between the patient and whoever's proposing that the patient go on the clinical trials. And the reason for this is probably very evident that in the past there were times where people had research performed on them in ways that they were not aware of and would never have agreed to. And after World War II and after the Nuremberg trials, there began to be really worldwide interest in spelling out how people should be approached about being in clinical trials and what their rights were. And any clinical trial that a person was thinking about going on would have a written document that would include all of this information. But just to go over kind of some of the high points. First of all, participation always has to be voluntary, and there should not be any kind of coercion. There shouldn't be like the doctor saying, well, if you don't want to be on the trial, go find another oncologist, or I can't do anything else for you if you don't do this trial. That kind of coercion is totally out of bounds. And it's also the case that the participation in the trial is really voluntary on a day-by-day basis, which is to say that if you enter a trial and you're going through the procedures and at a given point you decide that this isn't for you, the fact that you signed the consent form doesn't obligate you to stay on the study. So you're always free as a clinical trial participant to withdraw. And you can either withdraw verbally or you can withdraw in writing, but you are not obligated to continue forward. And then the last really important right to know about is that if new information comes along, either about the toxicity of the treatment that's involved in the trial, or about alternate treatments that turn out to be really spectacular and make the question in the current trial obsolete, the patient has to be informed about that, so that they can always be making the best decision about being in the study. Next slide. So this is this process-informed consent that I was mentioning, where the researchers have to give potential or enrolled participants in a clinical study information about the study that will help them decide whether or not they want to enroll and continue to participate. And the informed consent process is meant to provide enough information so that the person can fully understand the risks, the potential benefits, and the alternatives. There's also general guidance that it should be written at about the 8th grade reading level so that people are not prevented from participating who are not highly educated. The truth of the matter is these consent forms are usually reviewed by pretty big committees, and they get pretty long, and probably terms sneak in that don't meet that definition. But the idea is that it should be a pretty clear and easy to understand explanation of what's going on with the trial. And in general, the person who's going to be in the trial would have to sign the informed consent document before anything that was study specific was done. This says in general, but that's actually a pretty hard and fast rule. Next slide, please. So these committees I mentioned, these are called institutional review boards. And any interventional clinical trial has to be approved and monitored by one of these. And so these committees are made up of doctors and researchers and members of the community. So here at Yale, for example, there might be a medical student and a clergyman and a lawyer and patient and a patient advocate also sitting on the IRB. And the role of the IRB is to make sure that the study is ethical and that the rights and the welfare of the participants are always protected. And this means making sure that the research risks are minimized, that they're reasonable in relation to potential benefits. So for example, one thing that an IRB would never agree to would be, as an example, sham surgery. So if you had a research study that wanted to see if surgery was important on top of radiation, and you proposed that everybody would get radiation and everybody would be taken to the operating room and have an incision, but the cancer would only be removed in half of the people, that would never be permitted. There also usually is a safety review committee that looks at the data as the study is going along. And then there are some federal organizations or agencies that also provide oversight. And one of these is called the Office of Human Subjects Research Protection, and another would be the FDA. Next slide. So unfortunately, some patients face barriers to clinical trial participation, and I don't think this is probably an exhaustive list, but it was some of the things that are identified as being among the most common barriers. So one is living in a rural area and being far from the kind of a hospital or center that would offer clinical trials. Another is being uninsured or underinsured. And it's actually the case that a lot of times the research intervention, the particular drug or device that's involved in a clinical trial is not charged for. But some of the other things, the frequent doctor's visits and the blood draws, can be harder for people who are not insured. I've already mentioned that people who have multiple other medical problems or a poor level of fitness are often not included in trials. I think the whole question of do I want to be in a clinical trial, and have I heard enough about what clinical trials are available to me, may not occur to some people, and if they come from a background where many people were uninsured or underinsured, or they lived far from a medical center, it may be that their parents and their friends and their relatives who had cancer over the years might not have had access to clinical trials, and so then they're just not as likely to think about them. Some people have uncertainty about what the goals of clinical trials may be, and you see there in the corner a picture of Jackie Thomas, who's a health educator I used to work with when I was at Fox Chase, and her role really was to spend time with patients who were uncertain about what was the purpose of clinical trials, was it a good fit for them, and be somebody who could answer their questions. Although ideally it would always be your physician who was answering all of those questions. Sometimes people might not even be that comfortable bringing their questions or their uncertainties forward to their treatment team. Sometimes there are biases in the health system where people who are treating you might assume that you're not interested in clinical trials, even though that wasn't true. And then for some people, the requirements of transportation and parking and time off of work, if there are extra visits involved in being in a clinical trial, might be barriers. Next slide. So I just wanted to spend, I know I'm already a little bit over time, but I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about where I think the big research questions in locally advanced and more advanced gastric cancer are. So surgery has been one of our tools against cancer for many decades, and it remains very central to managing local gastric cancer. But we still have some questions about what is the best therapy to take before having surgery to shrink the cancer and give the surgeon the best chance of getting everything out. We are not quite sure if it's necessary to give therapy both before and after surgery, and there's some clinical trials looking at that question. Radiation is often given to people with stomach cancer in conjunction with their surgery, but exactly how necessary that is if they're getting chemotherapy before and after remains unknown. There's some interest in whether or not doing frequent PET scans while a person's receiving preoperative treatment can help decide whether it's the right chemotherapy that's being given. And as I was mentioning in the beginning when I was talking about the different subtypes of gastric cancer, there may be specific tests like the HER2 test and others that could be helpful in predicting which chemotherapy would be most beneficial right from up front. Next slide. And then what about in advanced gastric cancer? And here there are a lot of questions that are arising from the new work that we're doing to understand the gastric cancer cell at the molecular level. So a lot of the new treatments really are coming straight from basic science labs. So new understanding about those 4 different subtypes of stomach cancer and about the role of the immune system in controlling stomach cancer have really led to a lot of new ideas about how we should move forward. So we're trying to find out which different treatments are required for the different subtypes of stomach cancer, what the specific molecularly targeted treatments are that are good for the different subtypes. So a lot of people will have heard of Herceptin for HER2 positive stomach cancer, but there are other targets that are like HER2 that we're learning about. Immunotherapy clearly has some activity in this disease. Should everyone try it, or should we try to use biomarkers to pick out the people who are going to get the most benefit from it? And how should we integrate immunotherapy with standard treatments? Next slide. So this is a picture of somebody's CAT scan. He's somebody that I treated on a clinical trial that was open through a couple of the cooperative groups. And he got a combination of chemotherapy with a new molecularly targeted therapy. And you can see on the left-hand side, the kind of big grayish organ is his liver. And it had a lot of little spots in it that had arisen from his stomach cancer. And following treatment, you can see that those had shrunk dramatically. This is the kind of output that comes from a clinical trial that helps make a decision about if the treatment that's being studied is the right thing to give to patients. But it's also really important to understand who those patients were, because the same treatment could lead to a really nice response like this in one patient and not in another. Next slide. This is a a young man named Kurt. He said that it was okay for me to use his slides. I'm not violating any confidentiality here. And he was the first person I treated with immunotherapy for a gastroesophageal junction cancer well over 2 years ago now. And this picture was taken about a month ago. He was out, I felt sort of bad for the poor elk that he was trying to kill out there in Wyoming. But he's somebody who has been on 2 different clinical trials for his cancer now, and continues to lead a very full and active life. And I think point the way forward for other people with the same disease. I think that might have been my last slide. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I just wanted to kind of show you a list of the clinical trials that are open for advanced disease here at Yale, just to kind of give a flavor of the kinds of decisions our patients face. So for previously treated patients, we have a couple of different trials that look at a combination of ramucirumab, which is a medicine that deprives the stomach cancer of its blood supply, combined with pembrolizumab, which is an immunotherapy. We also have another trial with immunotherapy and a different anti-angiogenic agent, bevacizumab, so it's another treatment that can kind of deprive the cancer of its blood supply. For first-line patients, we have a combination of chemotherapy with or without ramucirumab, a medicine which gets at the blood supply. We have a first-line trial that compares immunotherapy with chemotherapy with the combination of immunotherapy and chemotherapy. For previously treated patients, we have an immunotherapy combination that actually gives 2 different immunotherapy drugs together. And for patients who've had Herceptin for HER2-positive cancers and progressed through it, there's a new HER2-directed medicine, and that's given together with immunotherapy. So depending on how much prior treatment a person's had and what type of prior treatment they've had, some of these options would be available. Not all of the options would be the right fit for every patient. Okay, so I hope we have time for a little bit of, and then questions that you should be thinking about asking your doctor when you're thinking about clinical trials. First of all, I would say that at any time that you're hearing about a change in therapy, you should at least ask, are you a candidate for a clinical trial? Because even if you're not going to do the clinical trial, hearing what the question in the clinical trial is can kind of help you understand a little bit more about the situation. If there's not a clinical trial available where you're being treated, how far would you have to go to have access to a clinical trial? And if you're considering a clinical trial, what do we know about the risks of the new treatment? How many people have had it before, and how have they fared? Okay, that really is my last slide, and I'd be happy to take some questions if we have a little time for that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burtness, for that very informative presentation. Since we are running behind on time, I will just select out one question here that I would like for you to address, and that is, if a clinical trial is seen as negative, or there's an approved drug for another cancer type, what are the options for stomach cancer patients to either continue on that trial or get access to a trial or approved drug that maybe there's not an approval for in gastric?
Okay, I think that what I'm understanding is a particular treatment was tried in stomach cancer and did not seem to improve over standard treatment. But
the patient is responding positively individually.
Oh,
and
well,
the trial perhaps discontinued.
Okay, so in general, when a clinical trial when a person's in a clinical trial, if they are benefiting from the treatment, they usually will not be removed from the treatment per force. So I mentioned that there's usually a data safety monitoring committee that will monitor a clinical trial as it's ongoing. A common thing might be that they would meet every 4 months or every 6 months and look at the data. If they found that there was no benefit from the treatment and they decided to stop the trial, usually those patients who were benefiting would still continue. However, you might imagine a situation where they found that the new treatment actually made things worse. And I can't think of a recent example in stomach cancer, but about 4 years ago, this happened in lung cancer with a monoclonal antibody to the insulin-like growth factor receptor. And so people were getting chemo with or without this antibody for lung cancer. And the trial had to be stopped early because the people who were getting the antibody were having more complications. They were having more infections and more heart attacks and more hospitalizations, and their overall survival was worse. And so you could have been a patient who was on that study, and it looked, and you were getting the IGF-1R antibody, and it looked to you like it was going pretty well. But in a situation like that, where the bad effect could happen at any time, just the fact that it hadn't happened to you yet wouldn't mean that it couldn't happen to you. So that's an example of a trial where when they closed the trial, everybody had to come off the treatment because there was a real concern that the treatment was making things worse for people. But if it's the other way around, just that it hasn't shown a benefit, in general, people will be allowed to continue out their treatment.
Okay, thank you so much for that response.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. And as you know, this webinar was brought to you by Debbie's Dream Foundation, Curing Stomach Cancer. Thank you to our speaker, Dr. Barbara Burtness of the Yale Cancer Center, and to Genentech for providing funding that helped make this webinar possible. As you can see on your screen, there are many events to get involved in and support. Details about these events are available on the Debbie's Dream Foundation website at www.debbiesdream.org. Thank you to all of our listeners today. This concludes our 12th of a series of 12 webinars on clinical trials. To view previously recorded webinars, please visit our lecture library. And we would love to hear your feedback and questions, as well as your thoughts. You can send your comments to patient.resource@debbiesdream.org.